So several years ago, I read a story. It was written by a man in his 30s, and he was recounting a childhood experience. And he said, growing up, he always thought his father was like a superhero, right? He was a mechanic, he was really strong. He just had this intense sense of safety and protection, and he knew that his dad would never let anything bad happen to him. And he said, then one day when I was 6 years old, I was out in the backyard and I was climbing a tree, and I climbed up a little higher than I normally did. And my foot slipped off the branch and I found myself hanging in midair from the tree. And so I called out to my father, who immediately ran out of the house and stood under me. And he said, it's okay, just let go, I'll catch you. And he said he looked down and it felt like 1,000 miles, and there's this puny man with twig-like arms telling him he's gonna catch him. And it took a lot of coaxing, but finally he let go, and of course his father caught him. I share this story because it is really the story of how we immerse ourselves in faith. It is that moment in our life when we let go, when we trust that God will catch us, when we place our lives in the very hands of God. The movement of grace in our life, that movement that comes from that experience of the cross and the willingness of Christ to offer his life to give us life, is that movement in which we begin that process of placing our lives in God's hands. It is that movement that moves us into that profound love of Jesus Christ poured out upon the cross that begins that transformation process. And so this Sunday, as we enter into the final few days of our Lenten journey, we hear this beautiful gospel proclaimed, a gospel that we know well, a story that we know well of the resurrection of Lazarus, of him being called from the tomb. And it has these beautiful details that speak to us of that experience of how that movement of grace is occurring in our life and in our world if we're but open to the love that God is offering us. And the movement of grace begins then with that radical trust, right? A radical trust in God's plan, a radical trust in a movement beyond ourselves to be a part of something more, to experience the more in our lives. And so we hear the voice of Martha say to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. We hear the reproach, right? We hear the frustration. In Martha's voice, we hear our own voice, because there is no way that we take this journey at some point we don't find ourselves saying to God, why? Why is this happening? Why did this have to happen? I called to you for help, but you were not there. In her voice, we hear our own voice, our own discomfort and frustration. And that grace of faith, that radical trust, that willingness to understand that God has a plan. And sometimes we clearly see how that plan is unfolding in our life, but there's other moments in our life when we cannot see the fullness of God's plan, and we wonder what the heck God is doing. That grace, that movement of grace, that trust in something beyond ourselves, beyond our own wisdom and knowledge, beyond our own control, is how that grace transforms. That's the grace of faith, to be able to let go, to take the leap, to trust that God has a plan and God will get us to where we need to go. And yes, it'll be challenging, and yes, it'll be uncomfortable, but to know that God will get us there. That trust, that radical trust, leads us to this incredible sense of how God is with us, right? This incredible sense of the living presence of God that lives and moves and walks with us day in and day out. No matter where we are, no matter what we are doing, we are connected to that source of grace and that power of life that will provide what we need in the moment that we need it in order to make those choices that lead us on a path to the glory and the light that God wants for us. And so we hear the shortest verse in the gospel today, right? 3 words. And Jesus wept. It's a powerful image. God weeps for his children. God weeps for the grief and the challenge and the frustration and the discord and disconnect that we feel at times. God speaks to us of that unity, of that oneness, of that desire, of that great want for him to be connected to us so that we might know the life and the death and the resurrection that he has in store for us. Because that's that movement of grace, right? That God moves us through life to let go of those things that are keeping us from the glory of resurrection. Ultimately, then, the story of Lazarus speaks to the glory of that experience of resurrection, of redemption. And that's indeed what the whole Lenten journey is about, right? That back to the basics, spiritual understanding, that foundation of why we walk into the desert, of that letting go of those things that are keeping us from being connected to the source of life so that we might know the richness of life as envisioned by God, as unfolded in our life by God's plan. And the reality is that every sin that we experience is a form of death in our life. Every sin we experience is a form of death. It disconnects us from the source of life that is Jesus Christ himself. And the word of Christ, that source of life, calls us out of the tomb to experience resurrection. And so he cries out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And that's the same voice we hear on this journey. Come out of the tomb. Experience the glory of the resurrection. Allow that grace, that love that I have for you, to raise you up beyond limitations and weaknesses so that you might experience what you were created to be experiencing as my child. This is the glory of the movement of grace in our life, that movement through life into death and the glory of the resurrection. The essence of our Lenten journey is to connect us more strongly to the reality of how God is with us, and the reality of how that profound love flows into us and through us as we take this journey together. It begins with that radical trust. It flows into us through that consistent understanding of God's presence in our life. And it is experienced in the glory of resurrection, of coming out of the tomb,